In his Histories, Herodotus explains that he has to talk about Egypt at length because it's just too remarkable, and boy, do I agree. As a student of ancient Egypt, I cannot believe it's taken me until 2024 to dig in to his work. I mean, it's an absolute treasure trove of absurd details, bewildering stories, and genuine horror and hilarity. There are few better or more colourful sources about the actual world and culture of ancient Egypt and Egyptians. Herodotus visited Egypt in around 450 BC when it was part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The lives and customs of ancient Egyptians can seem so impenetrable sometimes, and that's why Herodotus really stands out. Archaeology has done a great service to us for allowing us to see where normal people from ancient Egypt lived, and the way they lived to some extent, but most actual texts from ancient Egypt tend to be about religious rituals or the triumphs of great kings, not much about the ordinary life of everyday people. The actual texture of Egyptian society, the folklore, the weirdness, is seldom found in the historical record. But Herodotus gives us an absolute rainbow of an account, vivid with the strangeness of an alien world, and yet somehow the familiarity of home. Because of this, it's an amazing anthropological work, and the peculiarities and contradictions of Egyptian society can help us reflect on the peculiarities and contradictions of our own time. As I begin to rattle off some of these stories, it will become obvious why Herodotus is known as the father of history to most, but the father of lies to some. Some of these stories just simply cannot be true. And while I believe that Herodotus visited Egypt, not all scholars agree. Furthermore, he tends to see many of the things he describes in Egypt through the prism of his own Greek understanding, and he shoehorns in lots of connections to Greece when it's not really justified. For example, he believes that all of the Greek gods actually came from Egypt, and that the gods worshipped in Egypt are identical to the Olympian pantheon, when that's not really historically evidenced. However, whether all of this information is reliable or not, or whether we can take the insights from Herodotus' brief snapshot of ancient Egyptian culture and then extrapolate it outwards to the whole 3,000 years of Egyptian history, nobody can deny that these stories are brilliant. Whether providing insight into the daily life, customs, and religion of ancient Egyptians, or just the mad imaginings of a 5th century BC Greek, this stuff is ancient and amazing nonetheless. The first theme that really jumped out at me while reading Herodotus was the bizarre. And I mean, there really is a lot of strange stuff, both to him and to us, the modern reader. Firstly, Herodotus tells us that on a visit to an oracle of the god Amun, who he knew as Zeus, at the Siwa oasis, deep inside the windswept barrens of the Libyan desert, the oracle told him to subscribe to the Liberator YouTube channel for more wisdom and history. Really odd. Animals. The actual first bizarre thing that I want to talk about in Herodotus is his fascination with the Egyptians' obsession with various animals and their religion particularly. I mean, ancient Egyptians worshipped and possessed and sacrificed a whole bewildering menagerie of different beasties for all of their hundreds of different gods. Herodotus tells us that, for example, there was an absolute taboo, a prohibition on eating female cows in Egypt because they were sacred to the goddess Isis. Such taboos as this, however, are hard to generalize, and Herodotus is very aware of the cultural and religious diversity found in Egypt at this time. One interesting example of this diversity is that he says that Libyan people who lived in the northwest of the country were frustrated by this ban on eating female cows and really wanted to chomp them down. Libyan tribes had settled in Egypt from the late Bronze Age onwards as the Egyptian state's iron vice-like grip had slackened in the face of amphibious invasions from mysterious sea peoples, and as their trading partners in the eastern Mediterranean had all collapsed and been destroyed. These Libyans, however, were not to have their way. They were forbidden from eating cows by the local oracles, despite their protestations. I wonder if we have any Indian viewers watching, if this is evocative of the politics of cow eating in that part of the world. Herodotus also seems a bit confused about animal sacrifice in ancient Egypt. He doesn't quite seem to understand. He says that the Egyptians only sacrifice male bulls, male calves, geese, and sheep. This isn't quite correct though, especially if we look at the outrageous and spooky animal necropolises of Saqqara. It was a mania in late period ancient Egypt to raise tons of little animals for sacrifice and mummification. We're talking about little cats, little dogs, little crocodiles, little ibises, baboons. After a few centuries, the special catacombs and necropolises built to house these animal mummies began filling up to the tune of millions of animals. As a whole, as many as 70 million individual animal mummies are to be found deposited across 30 sites in modern Egypt. However, it's also true that not all animals who ended up in these hallowed catacombs were killed specifically for the purpose. Herodotus tells us about the ancient Egyptian obsession with cats. He tells us that if a house catches on fire, the people rush inside and save the cats first before anything or anyone else. He tells us that when a cat dies, people would shave their eyebrows in mourning and would then take their deceased cats lovingly to the city of Bubastis, the home of the cat god Bastet, and take the bodies to the temple there where special priests would take the cats and prepare their bodies for mummification and inter them in the hallowed catacombs there. This is all very weird, right? So what did this mean? Why were people obsessed with these animal mummies? Animals in ancient Egypt were seen as vessels or symbols of their respective gods, so crocodiles for Sobek, baboons or ibises for Thoth. The animal and god were seen to share some characteristics. The essence or an aspect of the god could be detected in the movements or behaviour of their animal underlings. These animals, the mass-produced ones who would go into the catacombs in their millions, were distinct from genuinely sacred animals, sacred individuals, who we'll discuss in a moment. So the industrialised sacrifice of these animals was seen as an act of devotion, the returning of a piece of the god's essence back to the eternal realms where these gods dwelt. How devotional or commercial this process was is debated among scholars. Some scholars will point out that some of these mummies didn't even contain the remains of the purported species, instead having the bones of a different species or just straw and wood padding. But other scholars will say that so many of these animals were so delicately wrapped that this really shows an earnest religious devotion at hand. So these mass-produced animal mummies were more like Catholic relics purchased by pilgrims as a way to curry favour with a god. The mummified animals themselves were prayed to and acted as divine intercessors, as they believed that the souls of the animals could hear the words of the human adorant and take those words into the divine realms to their masters. But why did this form of sacrifice become so popular in the late periods of Egyptian history? Well, perhaps it was a feature of a inward-looking and backward-looking society. A society that was clinging on to its most distinctive and arcane features in the face of a rapidly changing world, diminishing power abroad, and invasions from Babylonians, Assyrians, Greeks, Persians, and Romans. The Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson says, "Egypt's plethora of animal deities embodied native Egyptian values par excellence. Moreover, the gods represented age-old, unchanging forces that promised ultimate salvation, whatever the vicissitudes of real life." And then there's the genuinely sacred animals considered to be manifestations of a god. Killing one of these would get you killed yourself. These include sacred crocodiles. Herodotus describes one of these animals from Lake Moeris in the Fayum, the very heart of the Sobek and crocodile cult. He has gold and glass jewellery in his ears, he has gold bangles over his front legs, he's fed whole chickens and sacrificed animals. I mean, this is one pampered reptile. On his death, the sacred crocodile is placed within a sanctified tomb, a practice not unique to this region as seen by the wonderful mummified crocodiles of the Ptolemaic temple at Komombo. And here again we are faced with the problem of cultural diversity. Herodotus tells us that at Elephantine in the far south of the country, crocodiles aren't considered sacred at all, but are rather hunted and killed. Which is interesting because it also faces us with the radical transformations of time, because today in 2024, if you go to Elephantine, there are members of the Nubian community there who keep pet crocodiles as unfortunate tourist attractions. Of course, there's also the wonderful Apis bull, an incarnation of the creator artisan god Ptah, who is continuously reincarnated after the death of the former Apis, kind of like a bovine Dalai Lama. When the current Apis dies, priests begin the search for the next one and look for certain telltale signs. The priests look for a calf which is black apart from a white diamond on his forehead and the image of an eagle on his back. His tail hairs are double, and he has a beetle-shaped mark under his tongue. Apparently the mother of Apis will be known to his seekers, for she will appear in a beam of light, either sunlight or moonlight. Apis himself was used as an oracle. Specialised priests would interpret his movements and moods. On special occasions, Apis would be led through the streets of Memphis, garlanded with flowers, and he even had his own special harem of sacred cows, all to himself. This was one happy bovine, and interestingly was one of the most popular deities in Egypt. People love a god that they can meet and see rather than the abstract constructions of philosophers. The distinctly Egyptian fascination with animals is also apparent in their fear of them. Herodotus tells us that Egyptian priests would heap curses upon the heads of sacrificed animals, so that the creature's rage at being killed would be diverted onto their own heads and not onto the killers or Egypt as a whole. I'm not really sure of the mechanics of that, to be honest, but Herodotus tells us that Egyptians never ate the heads of animals as a result. They would sell them on to foreigners in the country if they could, otherwise they would dump these heads into the Nile. I think there's much food for thought here in how Egyptians viewed and treated animals, and many comparisons to be made with the modern world. The seeming tension between ancient Egyptians revering animals and slaughtering them en masse is a tension we have carried forward into our own society. For we love dogs, and even a cute calf or pig will get mountains of likes online, while untold billions of chickens, pigs, and more are sent through sheds dense with excrement and abattoirs rank with blood. Festivals and customs. Moving on from animals to humans, Herodotus gives us some fascinating and quite funny accounts of ancient Egyptian festivals. Their festival to Dionysus, by whom Herodotus means Osiris, the Egyptian god of the underworld and agriculture, is a particularly intriguing and bizarre one. It involved people of every age carrying little wooden statues of the god on strings like marionettes, which had movable heads and arms and also large erect phalluses, which you could move up and down with one of these strings. This is pretty funny. I mean, just imagine the sight of this constantly. Funnily enough, though, our Greek narrator, who we often identify with as he raises an eyebrow at Egyptian customs, isn't particularly shocked by this one. Phallic processions were an integral part of Greek religion and had been since the Neolithic. And just as an aside, the Romans loved a phallus too. Look at this particularly amusing specimen from Pompeii. And the festive madness does not stop here. In the festival at Bubastis, people from all around the country would approach the city on canoes, singing at the top of their lungs and playing pipes and clappers. When they passed riverside villages, the people in the canoes would shout obscenities at the villagers, blah, 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 and the women would expose themselves. This was all before reaching the city of Bubastis, where there were sacrifices galore and more wine was drunk on a single day, Herodotus says, than in the rest of the year combined. He says that up to 700,000 people from across Egypt would come to Bubastis for this festival. Or more serene and moving is the Lamplight festival of Sais, where people would go out at night, all lighting lamps together, and stand in circles around their houses in the dark. Just imagine that scene, like a million fireflies in that warm, ancient night. Each lamp doubled by its luminous reflection on the Nile's broad face. And the strange customs just keep on coming. You know, Herodotus tells us that when another human died in ancient Egypt, then the people would smear mud all over their faces, loosen their clothes, and go out into the street beating their breasts and wailing. I mean, I'd like people to do that at my funeral. And to end the section on the bizarre on a slightly more silly note, Herodotus tells us that, as evidenced by the remains of a battlefield between the Egyptians and Persians, Egyptians' skulls were much thicker than that of the Persians or of other peoples. The explanation he gives for their thick skulls is that when Egyptians are young, they shave their heads, leaving their domes exposed to the harsh sun, and he believes that this, well, the harsh sun essentially thickens their bones. So, yeah, right.
Right.
Disgusting. Let's move on now and talk about the disgusting. We've talked about the bizarre, and now a lot of these disgusting stories are also bizarre, but yeah, if you like gross things, then this'll cheer you up. Let's just start with a clear example, and this really seems to shock Herodotus, and well, it might. He says that in the time he was visiting Egypt in the province of Mendes, a remarkable thing happened in this province in my time. A goat mated with a woman, for all to see. And then, just to labour the point, this happened in public view. Alright, okay, you see now this is the kind of stuff we're dealing with. When I said disgusting, I really meant disgusting. Herodotus also tells us quite disturbingly when discussing funerary rites and mummification that when the wife of an eminent man dies, or a particularly beautiful woman dies, that they leave the body in the house for 3 to 4 days. They do this before taking the body to the embalmers precisely because they don't want the embalmers to have sex with the body. I know, right? And he says that this started because a guy was actually found having sex with a body, and this kind of started this policy. Disgusting, I know, shocking. I'm sorry for sharing that with you. Despite the gross factor, I actually find this very interesting. This is because we relate to ancient Egypt so much through its art, through its glittering coffins and monuments covered with wings and eyes and symbols, and it's all very mysterious and dignified. And then we find out they had their own fair share of weirdos and perverts as well. In an odd kind of way, I find this sort of comforting and humanizing. Behind the stern and elegant facade of ancient Egyptian elite culture, there was a whole weird variety of individuals. There's also the story of the so-called pharaoh Pheros. Not probably a real person, his name seems to just be a corruption of the word pharaoh. I mean, please, Ra, Osiris and Anubis, I hope this guy wasn't real, and you will too after hearing this. So, apparently one time when Pheros was the king, the Nile was flooding its banks and raging in a big storm, and Pheros was upset and enraged by this, and in his arrogance picked up a spear and launched it into the river in defiance of its flood. Herodotus, who also tells us the story of the Persian Emperor Xerxes having the seas flogged because they destroyed his bridges over the Hellespont as he tried to invade Greece, loves a story of man's hubristic and futile attempts to control nature. Pheros' sacrilege against the river is not left unpunished. He's stricken with blindness, and for 10 years he remains blind. Then an oracle tells him that he will be cured of his blindness if he washes his eyes with the urine of a woman who has only ever slept with her husband. He tries this with loads of women, including his own wife, but it doesn't work. Eventually he does find a woman whose urine cures him, and then he rounds up all of the previous contestants, puts them in a house, and burns them all alive. He goes on to marry the pure woman who cured him of his blindness. This sounds like a bit of a misogynistic morality play to me. And to round off this video and this theme of the disgusting, why not end with some light cannibalism? In Book 3, Herodotus turns to the Persian invasion of Egypt under their great king Cambyses. He tells the story of a particular Persian general called Phases, who, in his invasion of Egypt, leaves his sons on duty somewhere, who are then captured by Greek and Carian mercenaries working for the Egyptians. And this is a particularly grisly episode because then, in full view of the Persian army, the Greeks and Carians bring out a large stone bowl, the same sort of bowl used in sacrifices. Then, one by one, they bring the Persian general's sons to the bowl and cut their throats, filling the vessel with gore. They then mix the blood with wine and water, and in full view of the boy's father, drink it. I think you'll actually be reassured then, dear viewer, that the Egyptians and their savage Greek and Carian mercenaries are subsequently defeated in the battle, although apparently it was a close thing. That'll do for part 1 of this scintillating journey through the culture and customs of ancient Egypt as told by Herodotus. We have discussed the bizarre and the disgusting in this episode, but in part 2 we'll be discussing the comedic, the funny, as well as the profound. It's going to be an absolute stonker of a follow-up. The only way you'll be able to know when this drops and to see the cherry placed upon the Black Forest gatto of a narrative that Herodotus gives us is by subscribing and hitting the bell button for notifications. And thank you so much for your time. I will see you there. Bye bye.